From work and just
Yeah.
Hey,
And
I'm
if
sure
you're
there's not a lot going on in your world, right?
if you're feeling,
know.
yeah, if you're feeling extra playful, Tank, you can come to our 7 o'clock dance class. It's like a dance
there you
party.
go. Yeah, I was
It's a
telling
full-on
Daryl,
dance party.
I don't know if you heard, but speaking of dance, I was talking to Daryl about your latest round of the dance off, and we got a chance to watch. My kids love watching those, by the way. But
No way.
the level of choreography is going through the roof.
Yes. We did not win this year, though. London is just kicking our butt every year.
They
By the
were.
way,
That was
do you
powerful.
stay in touch with Chief K much?
Yes, we talk probably, email back and forth and so forth. I'd say probably every other week. So
Okay.
Oh,
Oh yeah.
good.
No,
yeah,
he's been in touch with us quite a bit, sort of after he
Yeah.
even left towards Europe, and then our
Yeah,
last
he
actual
sent-
academy, he
yeah.
sent a whole team of people from all over Europe, so
Yeah,
different chiefs from all over.
wonderful. Yeah, I appreciate the invites to that, and we'd like to take advantage whenever you guys have room. Really powerful, and especially as we form our culture here in Space Command, just being able to see what you guys have offered and have learned from so many different leaders around the world would be amazing.
Yeah.
And so, Tank, is Space Command like just a different DoD division, like a service now? It's like it's not part of Air Force.
Yeah, it's a great question because there's a lot of confusion just because there's so much activity in space. But we have 11 combatant commands, and those are the way we take the services capabilities and we synergize and integrate them into warfighting. And so we have functional and geographical combatant commands. As an example, we have NORTHCOM that is basically responsible for homeland defense. And then we have, you might have heard of Central Command, that's the Middle East, and Afghanistan, Iraq, and what's going on over there. So those are examples of combatant commands. So Space Command is a combatant command, and we're actually responsible for 100 kilometers and up. You could say to infinity and beyond. We kind of
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
but that's our area of responsibility. And so not only are we ready to fight in space, but also continue to deliver effects from space to support the terrestrial fight. So GPS,
But technically, it's still within the Air Force then.
Well, yeah. So yeah, that's the other part of your question is, so we've also, just to confuse everybody and our enemies, by the way, we've stood up Space Force. So, juxtaposed against Space Command is the Space Force, which is our 5th service. So Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, now Space Force. And it's set up very similar to how the Department of the Navy is set up. So the Department of the Navy has obviously the Navy and the Marines in it. So 2 services, but 1 department. And so they have 1 secretary based on civilian leadership of the military, which is one of our foundational tenets. So the Secretary of the Navy oversees the Navy service and the Marine as a service. Right. Same thing with the Secretary of the Air Force, basically oversees the service of the Air Force and then the service known as the Space Force. Hope that helps.
Yeah.
And then Space Command is separate from Space Force.
Right. And so inside Space Command, we have people like me who are in the Air Force. We have Navy, Marines, and Army, and now Space Force. And so the services come together and they bring their capabilities, and we integrate that to fight in, from, and to space.
I can definitely see how it confuses the enemy and us all.
That's good.
As long as we confuse the enemy more than ourselves.
Yeah.
Right.
Have you watched the Netflix at all?
Oh, wait.
So I have to admit, I watched the trailer, and but I haven't seen any of the episodes.
Okay, I haven't seen the episodes yet. I heard it got a low rating, but.
Okay. Well, we hope to get a higher rating as Space Command and Space Force, but Joe Raymond's had fun with that. And, anything I think that just, educates and provides, even if it's, slightly humorous, sort of this mindset that there's a lot going on out there is really important, because a lot of times, even we inside the military take for granted the capabilities we bring from space, but just to be able to use your credit card at the gas pump, to be able to use your phone to navigate around town, to do banking transactions, everything, is empowered by the capabilities that we have on orbit. So just really
Very cool.
understanding that so the public understands that is really important to us.
It's cool.
So but we don't mind. We don't mind the Netflix.
Well, Charlie, Megan, and Tank, I want to keep us on our timeline. So it is 1 o'clock, and I wanted to quickly cover a couple admin remarks for the folks that have just joined. This is a webinar format, so that means we can't see you, we can't hear you. You obviously can hear and see us, but we can interact via the chat. So I encourage you to use the chat for the Q&A. Please put your questions into chat for the general. There will be a Q&A period at the end. And I'll do my best to get as many of your questions to the general as we can. So with those admin remarks, let me turn it over to our co-CEOs of NextJump, Charlie Kim and Megan Messenger, for a quick intro.
So just really quick, and this is Charlie and this is Megan here. We're co-CEOs of NextJump, and we built and run COA. And we want to introduce and welcome General Leonard. He's known as Tank, his call sign. He looks like a tank. If you actually see his full body, very, very fit. And when we first met Tank, it was several years back. I can't remember exactly when, but it was maybe like 3-4 years back. It was through a schoolhouse within the Air Force called Pace University. Pace. And they had an award they created highlighting just stellar airmen in the Air Force. They saw just have great, futures and bright futures. And Tank was one of the individuals, and part of the award, the recipients got 3 days to spend either in our Boston or New York office as part of our leadership academy. And the way that the team that worked at Pace described Tank to us was that this individual, this general, has the makings to be the head of the Air Force one day. And so, very, very spoken highly of. We got to know Tank. We spent a lot of time then when Tank was head of Luke Air Force Base, around 10,000 people in Phoenix, and we went and spent time with them quite a bit back and forth. And he went and spent a year in Afghanistan as I think the head of the Air Force there, and then came back now as the number 3 in the Space Command. And so Tank has been a dear friend, and he's a leader that we've learned a lot from, and I think we've kind of learned from each other. And we just appreciate all the time we've spent. So we're excited to have him come, get approved even by the Air Force to be able to come and share and speak here. So without further ado,
Tank.
kind of want to turn over to Tank.
Awesome. Thank you, Charlie and Megan. I just count you guys as dear friends as well. And also just compatriots in, making our lives at work and at home great. And so I can't say enough about the impact you've had at my life, both at home and at work. And millions of people. I really think that you've had that sort of reach over the years where you've done this sort of pro bono and elevated all of our lives. And so thank you. It's been wonderful. It's fun to be back, just to be back sort of in touch and to be back at this online academy. And also, I just want to let everybody know, it's always great to have a Marine whenever you go into a difficult situation. So I recognize Earl's service, and it's good to see him up online as well as Raleigh. I know at NextJump, everyone commits themselves to sort of the mission of not only making the business grow, but also to growing leaders. And so I just want to acknowledge Raleigh for his incredible efforts in making this all happen. And to everybody kind of around the Zoom sphere, if you want to call it that, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm excited and honored to be a part of this, to join this incredible community and obviously the associated online academy. I love, the fact that you are serving each other. In fact, as I lead our pandemic response here at United States Space Command. And so I monitor kind of what other people are doing and best practices out there. And I saw you guys immediately sort of jump into how do we continue to develop and grow our people. And so this online academy certainly has done that. And in many ways, enabling people to let this pandemic not derail them, but develop them. And so it's just really fun to be amongst a like-minded community and to see how you guys continue to serve each other and not just kind of the business part of each other, but the families, even the children. So just really incredible. And I just want to let you know that while I'm in the military and serving is one of our core values, that we don't have a corner on that market. In fact, that's really the responsibility of all of us to serve each other, to make the world and our lives a better place. And so it's just really fun for me to, like I said, join a like-minded community that values service and leadership. So I'm gonna take on a very daunting task. I'm gonna try to boil 27 years down into 27 minutes. And I'm also gonna take on an equally hard task, and that's boiling down leadership into 3, areas that I'm basically gonna propose to you are the ultimate responsibility of leaders. Now, there are so many things that leaders do and so many different ways to think about that. So this is certainly a daunting task, but it's one I'm very passionate about and one that I think is super important to what we do. And so I'm going to take that on today, and I appreciate you joining me do that. And I have seen sort of these 3 things that I'm going to get to just pop up time and time and time again. So not only do they make a huge impact to the organizations and the individuals that are a part of those organizations, but they have basically been branded into my mind through experiences in combat, both humorous and hard, emergency response situations, peacetime activities, so just the day-to-day operations that we do, to include sort of the administrative part of our lives as leaders, as well as the operational part of our lives as leaders. They're simple, but they're hard. And, kind of my intent today is to just make a subtle difference, to shed a little bit of light, to remind you of maybe some similar stories in your life story, and maybe kind of help you search out and remind you of some reasons and methods that you have for leading and make a difference in the world. And I really boil down making that difference to just truly taking care of the person to the left and to the right of you. And by doing that, kind of elevating the game of your team, and then, that effect slowly spreads outward from there. And so these 3 areas are, number 1, rehearsing reality. Number 2, resourcing the mission. And number 3, recultivating your culture. And I would wrap them all up by saying it's ridiculous intentionality. Now, I don't mean to conjure up in your mind sort of this sense of ridiculousness as in frivolity or, sort of humor that doesn't really have a place. The ridiculous part is the fact that you are going to do sort of the simple or the common uncommonly well. And so there's a sort of intensity that kind of generates surprise. There's sort of an intensity that is unusual. And so when I say ridiculous, it's that sort of intensity applied to intentionality. And that's how I kind of summarize them out. But to start off with number 1, rehearsing reality. So this is pre-examining the risk to mitigate its impact to you personally and to the team. You could also kind of quantify it as a pre-mortem rather than a post-mortem. So post-mortem, right, you examine the body, you find out the cause of death. Pre-mortem is you say, hey, what would cause that? So it's future looking. Another way to look at that is through someone I admire greatly, and that's Admiral Stockdale, who was a prisoner of war for many years. And there's a thing that they call the Stockdale paradox. And it comes out of a quote that he had where he just tells, everyone, the way that he survived multiple years in captivity and brutal torture and took care of his team and made those folks better was through having faith that you will prevail, but at the same time, the discipline to confront really the brutal facts of the reality that you have in place. But it's sort of that mindset, that Stockdale paradise, not just for now, but for the future. So it's a pre-mortem, it's a forward-looking preparation of your team. And so I'm going to go through each one of these with some stories. And so my first story is, as a young squadron commander, the first time in the military that you're truly responsible for the lives and welfare of other people, as well as accomplishing the mission. I recognized that I had a lot to learn. My squadron was a little bit smaller than most Air Force squadrons. And so I found the biggest squadron on my installation that had multiple times as many people. And I went to that squadron commander and said, hey, I'd like to hang out with you and learn all your lessons, because I knew they would be different and in more volume than what I would learn just given the size of the people that I had. And so I teamed up with the maintenance squadron commander at Nellis Air Force Base, and he and I learned a lot together. And one unfortunate Sunday morning, we got a call that one of the young airmen in his squadron had died. It happened to be that this airman also supported our squadron. He was a maintainer. He worked at fixing F-16s. really just the personality of the squadron. You know it in your individual organization, someone that really carries the day, always has a smile on his face. And he unfortunately had passed away accidentally early that morning. So I got to go through next of kin notification. And we honored sort of his family wishes by really not spreading the word until we had notified all of his family. That was a little more complicated than it normally could be. So we finally accomplished that late Sunday night. And our plan was to bring everybody in on Monday, all his coworkers, and let them know kind of what had happened. Of course, very hard time. And we had chaplains, mental health providers, resources, so folks could work through kind of the sudden news that you can just imagine. So I was there along with this other squadron commander. We broke the news, just devastation, as you can imagine. And so we had a flying schedule that day that we had to execute. And then we started considering, just based on, really the devastation, were people mentally ready? What was the risk that we were taking on? And we considered the other side of the equation, sort of the opportunity and the need that we had to take that risk. And we decided that the afternoon schedule that we had scheduled was not necessary based on the risk, but the evening schedule, based on the fact that we were going to do some training at night that we needed to do, was worth the risk, and it would give us a little bit more time to get folks ready. So the decision was mine. I made the decision to cancel that first part of the schedule. And then dutifully, I went back to my commander. So I left the group in mourning, and they were being taken care of. So I went to my commander and told him that what I had done. He was already aware of the situation. And he looked at me and said, "Tank, what would happen if you died in combat? Would you expect your squadron to either take a knee or take the hill? In other words, stop, right, and stop providing the resources that the team needed, or continue?" And I told him I would absolutely want them to continue to provide their part of the fight to protect and defend those forces on the ground, et cetera. And he said, "Tank, how are you going to prepare your squadron to be able to do that unless you take advantage of this opportunity right now?" And I was blown away. I had never even considered that. The way I was raised was, something like this happens, and it happened to me before, we took a knee. We didn't need to fly. So, why do it? And of course we would do that in combat, where we would not take a knee and we would take the hill. And I was just struck by that. And I was trying to process that. And he said, "We're flying." And so in the military, you have the option, it's a lawful order. So if you don't agree, you can dissent and talk about it. And so I kind of, explained the risk to my commander. And in the end, even though I was having a hard time with the decision, I knew that he knew something I didn't know. And so I trusted him. I made it my decision. We call that loyalty. And I marched right back into the group I had just left minutes before. And I said, "Okay, we're flying." And I told them about the risk I knew that was out there, but I knew they could do it. And, really started to try to tell them why, but it was very much lost on them and very unusual. And so, but they knew they were doing that. And like great airmen, they started taking on the task of getting ready to do that. And so I went back out, reported back into my commander, and told him that I had just, done that and had followed his orders. And he was on the phone with the higher echelon of maintenance leadership. And, I heard him kind of talking, and then he turned back to me. He goes, "All right, we're not going to fly. We'll do the night sortie like you said." He goes, "You need to go back and tell them that." And so, I'm like, holy cow, they're already looking at me like I had two heads. Now I'm going to have three heads. And I marched right back in there and said, "All right, we're not flying." And, they looked at me like, "Serious this time?" But anyways, it was a great lesson learned. I took a little bit longer path going back to my group commander's office that time, and I spent some time thinking about what I was trying to learn. Got back to his office, and he said, "Tank, what did you learn? What have you learned from that?" That was his question to me. And I told him, I said, "Sir, I've really learned a lot. I've learned one, I never was taught that was an important thing to prepare my organization for, but I realized fully that is my responsibility as the leader. But to do that, you really have to prepare ahead of time. We had never pre-mortem sort of this sort of thing. How would we continue flying in light of that?" And so to carry this kind of story forward, subsequent to that, a couple of years later, I was a commander in combat this time. And there were forces on the ground engaged with the Taliban and lots of other bad folks in Afghanistan. And they needed our support 24/7, every second of the day. And unfortunately, we had one of our F-16 pilots crash and died from the impact. And because I had taken those squadrons that came into my group at that time, and ahead of time told them, you need to prepare your organization for going forward in combat, even in the face of someone dying in your organization, either accidentally or at the hands of the enemy. They were ready. They had sort of war gamed that. They had pre-mortemed it. They had rehearsed it. And so they were ready. It doesn't make it that much easier. It does a little bit. It does buy down a little bit of the risk. It's still really tough. But it was interesting as people were sort of reacting to this crash, there was this sort of sense that we would leave the ground forces exposed. And it was really great to have taken that lesson, applied it, and then being able to tell the ground forces and everybody else, no, we were ready. We stretched out some of the flights of the folks that were already airborne. We found folks in the unit that could mentally handle that. And we were appreciative to that. And we took care of the rest and maintained continuous coverage. And so, you know, coming out of that experience, it just really, like I said, branded upon my heart and my mind. And I'm reminded of Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great. You know, it's really not the best practice to motivate. Sure, it's, you know, and I love to motivate people. I'm an extrovert. I love the rah-rah speech, both listening to them and giving them. But it's actually more important to prepare your folks than to motivate them. And Jim Collins breaks that out in his book, and I wholeheartedly believe that. So often we imagine the past to remember the future. Imagine the past to remember the future. That's actually backwards. We need to remember the past to imagine the future. And we often get it backwards. And so that's why I think it's so important to rehearse reality. You will face challenges, but you want to grow through those challenges. And so have you prepared your team for that? My second thing is to resource the mission. So when I say resources, that's both time and money. And really, I would tell you that this is using intentionally the power to give and take. And so that's kind of a cliche, but let me break that down. First of all, I'll tell you a story. When I was the wing commander at Osan Air Base in South Korea, we had just introduced a new inspection system. And this was really a huge improvement of what we had done before. Where we sort of had centralized it and elevated it. A lot of reasons, because, you know, we were responsible for a nuclear command and control in the Air Force, and that's obviously a very important mission. And so over time, we had slowly morphed that very, you know, appropriate attention to detail into this inspection system where you kind of learn the dance, what the inspectors wanted to see, and then you kind of perform the dance. And it started to separate from really the capabilities and the requirements that were truly needed. And so we revamped it, and we pushed it down to lower level commanders. And so as a wing commander, this was the first time I had responsibility at that level to run my own inspection system, still based on the requirements of the Air Force and our nation. And I love this acronym. We call it the TIG, you know, the Inspector General. So whenever you have a title that includes the word the, you're really super important. And he was out at Osan because this was the one of the first inspections under this new inspection system. And I had known him well. He was also an F-16 pilot, and he came into my office as, you know, sort of the inspection was kicking off. And he's like, Tank, I am so glad you haven't talked to me about how I haven't resourced your inspection office. And, you know, I looked down at my list, you know, kind of below the table. And my first topic that I wanted to talk to him about is how he hadn't resourced my manning in my inspection office. And so, you know, I kind of discreetly cross that off, and I was thankful that I allowed him to talk first to avoid putting my foot in the mouth. And I was like, you know, yeah, yes, sir. And so he went on to explain. He's like, listen, if I would have done that, I basically, because I'm responsible for, you know, the inspection offices across the entire Air Force, I would have come up with a one size fits all. And because of that, you know, all of you wing commanders would have been at least slightly or a lot frustrated at me, because I would have dictated how you were going to do that. And you all have different mission sets and different circumstances. So instead, I've given that over to you. You can do that however you want. You're the wing commander. You're responsible for this. And so I'm going to allow you to move resources around to accomplish it. And boy, I'll tell you, that just hit me like a ton of bricks. I was in charge, you know, and I'd never really, I mean, even as a wing commander responsible for 8,000 people, you know, just south of North Korea and just all that's going on up there, you know, that was my responsibility. I was in charge. I was ridiculously in charge. And And so often, we say, well, we're not really in control. Like my boss has a, certain amount of authority that they won't delegate, or some sort of center or functional, or maybe there's a policy or something that I just can't quite get around. I'll tell you, even as someone that's been in command 8 years, been in the military for 27 plus, you have an incredible amount of control. And even if you're like, well, I'm only in charge of 2 or 3 people, or, maybe $10 or $12, you really have a lot more control than you can ever imagine. And I indict myself in this too. Like, we truly have never explored the amount of leadership and influence that we have. And so I just implore you to do that. And it is your responsibility to do that. And so just sit down and think about that. You set schedules, you set attitudes, you set habits. It's amazing. But the other part of resourcing, not only the give, right, but it's the take. And I'll tell you, one of the things I've learned, sort of in this resource the mission, is that you actually, it's more important in life what you say no to than what you say yes to. For me, it's saying no to cookies. That helps me out a lot. But no is powerful. No is black and white. No. Yes comes with this sort of degree of yes, right? Like, how much yes? Like, yes to me is different than yes to you. So what do you mean, right? No is no, right? And so you'll be defined more by what you say no to than what you say yes. And in fact, that's a great place to start as a leader. And sort of this is my second story in this category, is the stop doing story. The Air Force said, hey, like we just have too much junk. We need to streamline and focus on the mission. And so we came out with a stop doing campaign. So I gathered my squadron commanders and said, hey, what should we stop doing? And come back to me the next time with at least one thing. And I thought, boy, I'm going to get 1,000 things from all these guys. We would love to stop doing sort of these things that are, feel urgent but aren't important. And they came back to me and they had nothing. I'm like, I just gave you a blank check. And some of it was, we had already kind of pruned, sort of the things that weren't as necessary back. The other thing was, wow, now I'm passing kind of sort of risk to them, right? It becomes their responsibility because they brought it up. And then some of it was just this sort of, how do we imagine, what's important versus urgent? So there's some training need there too that I was responsible for, not them. And so when I tried it again as the commander out at Luke, what I did was I basically wrote a form letter, and at the bottom I signed it. I wrote it to my commander, and I just allowed them to fill in the blanks. We need to get after these priority missions, fill in the blank, fill in the blank, fill in the blank. And therefore, based on resources, we're going to stop doing fill in the blank, fill in the blank, fill in the blank. So I did give them a blank check, but I was signing the blank check. And you would be shocked at the amount of great ideas I got. And so we put a lot of those into fruition. And at Luke, we were able to focus on some things that are really important to make a difference because of the great ideas that came from them. But what I learned from that was kind of twofold. One, I needed to do some training and education. Two, as a leader, it was my ultimate responsibility to resource the mission, both from a give and take perspective, and yet at the same time, enable them to bring their ideas forward because they knew things and saw things that I just wouldn't be able to see and know. And so it is a collaborative environment, but as a leader, you have to take that step towards your subordinates and towards your organization to really start doing the right thing and resourcing the mission. So I ask you, is your team resourced for its mission? Number 3, recultivate culture. So my proposition to you is as a leader, you're a gardener. You're a grower, you're a developer. And sort of the culture is your soil. And so out of that soil and the goodness of that soil, one of the things we've been doing in COVID is experimenting with home gardens, right? So if they're going to run out of Brussels sprouts, at the commissary, I'm going to grow them. And so built some planters, but you might have this really great or really poor planter, doesn't matter. What kind of soil do you have? And you need to refresh that soil. And so I've been learning about how to be a gardener for real, but being a gardener as a leader is really important. And the model that I like to use in my mind as I grow and develop and recultivate culture, so sort of renew and refresh it, is to grow this leader model. And this is very familiar, I'm sure, to all the folks associated with NextJump. In fact, I really have developed this model over the years from what I've learned from Charlie and Megan and the great team and all the other participants in so many of these leadership forums. but it's about decision making. That's the currency of leadership, and everyone's a leader regardless of if you're in charge of somebody, because you can at a minimum lead yourself. But to develop this leader model to make folks daily great decision makers, as I like to say, you need to give them clarity, competence, and then kind of sort of the ability to command and control. And that's a military term, but basically it comes down to, you have the authority, and then how are you going to run that authority and communicate that across the group? And so for clarity, one of my favorite stories was I was out at Osan again. This is in South Korea. We have the mission, we call it the Fight Tonight mission. And so that's kind of our banner for we need to be ready at any time, to protect the freedom of 51 million people in South Korea. And so, taking that mission on very passionately, and the fact that we rotate troops over there quite frequently, there's sort of this idea that you need to do indoctrination very intensely. And so we had a great sort of welcome to everybody where we kind of set the stage. And, I said, fight tonight, probably like 12 times a minute. Everybody's pumped up. This is a motivational speech, like I said before, right? But was I preparing them? And it just hit me in the forehead after one of these speeches, right after I took command, when an airman in the front row stands up and it's like, "Sir, I'm ready to fight tonight. Now what do I need to do?" And I was like, wow, yeah, like I had not equipped any of these folks besides a bunch of rah-rah speeches and getting them all excited, but we hadn't told them what was our operational plan and what would you be doing at Osan and what would you be doing if you're in one of our squadrons. And so, what we did was we reconfigured a building so we could talk at a higher classification level, and we actually taught and educated those folks right when they got there on exactly what we were supposed to do. And so I could answer that question right away and point them in a direction where they could continue to learn more. But yeah, we wouldn't be ready to fight tonight unless everybody on the peninsula was ready to fight tonight. And so I needed to provide that clarity. The next thing I needed to provide was sort of competence. And so we used a program, it's called a verification. It's something that's very centric to the fighter pilot community in the Air Force, where you essentially take your mission, you do the math, and you report out to the senior leaders. So you might be very, junior in grade, but you're going to report out to one of the more senior officials on base, and you're going to talk to them about the details that you figured out about the mission. And then you're going to say, is this planned right or not? Could we do this better? And so it's a learning environment, not only for the individual, but the entire group. But we'd only do that for sort of pre-planned fighter missions. And so I said, well, why not take that concept and expand it? And we did. We expanded it to other missions inside the operations group. We expanded it to the maintenance group. They'd figure out how many tires do we need. Super important. If you don't have tires, you're not going to be launching airplanes. But we had never really kind of done the math. And in the med group that supported us from a sort of a casualty rate and a recovery perspective, they hadn't done that math either. And so we spread this across the wing, and we gave people the competence to make the right decisions. And we became that much more ready because they sort of had that education and training. And then the last piece, the command and control piece, I prefer to use John Boyd's words of leadership and appreciation versus command and control. One sounds sort of, in your face, and the other one is really more of a collaborative effort. But needless to say, how do you run that sort of communication loop to be able to make sure you have shared understanding and shared execution? And so I offer you kind of one last story, and that's, again, as the wing commander at Osan in South Korea, we exercised a lot because we wanted to be ready, back to my earlier point on rehearsing reality. And this building was over-hardened, and in fact, you could survive in a chemical environment, so we didn't have to necessarily wear all the gear that you would being outside under the threat of chemical attack. It was air-conditioned. This is the middle of August in Korea. It's hot, humid, and, we're kind of watching with cameras. How are people doing? We're getting reports. Is everybody okay? Because, again, even when we're exercising, we want to test our metal, but, we don't want to break that metal. And so I'm asking everybody, how's everybody doing? What do you think? Is it good? We still learning? And I wouldn't get the answers I wanted. So I grabbed my chief, who's my senior enlisted. We went outside, we put on the full gear. I learned how to drive in the full gear, which is interesting because you got like 12 layers of clothes. We drive down to where operations were going. They were basically taking the A-10, magnificent airplane, and getting it ready to go for its next round of sorties. Again, simulating attacks and protecting and defending the freedom of South Koreans. And we were in between where we had just launched a big wave and now we're coming back. And the maintainers were out there just sweating, loading, bombs and missiles by hand and machine and fixing the airplanes. And the A-10 is very tall. The engines are more than 18 feet off the ground. And there was this airman up on top of one of those engines, just scurrying around trying to fix it to get it ready to go. But he just had his normal uniform on. I had like the 18 layers of chemical protection. I had my mask on, and it's just shocking, right? It's like nowadays when you see someone without a mask on, you're just shocked, right? So this is even more shocking because it's like mask and body mask, if you will. And I'm like, hey, I'm talking through this mask. What are you doing up there? And he kind of scrambled down. He realized his wing commander, thought he was in trouble because, he doesn't look like the rest of us. And he said, sir, I've gone to your brief. I understand our mission. I know I need to get this A-10 ready to go. I felt like I was up on top of this airplane, in my rubber boots and all this gear, and I would either pass out or slip and fall off. I could endanger myself. I was willing to take that personal risk to get this line, ready to go. And I'm like, that is a great decision, just this big smile erupts on his face. And, it was this wonderful moment as a wing commander going, man, a clarity, competence, decision-making, all the way down this lower level. I'm just totally excited. But I needed to close the loop with him. And I said, well, who else did you tell? And he gets worried again, sir, nobody. I go, come on, let's take a walk to the next hardened shelter over. Let's see what's going on over there. And I was hoping, and I got what I wanted. Another maintainer, this time in full ensemble, struggling to fix the A-10. Not on top of the engine, that would have been perfect. This was less than perfect. He's down on the wing, but still struggling. You could still tell he's kind of slipping around, not the safest of things. And I'm like, he might have benefited from your decision. And if you could have told maybe your line supervisor or just kind of passed the word, maybe you would have benefited some other people, And I was glad he didn't feel too bad, but he really understood. And, but I said, I owe you something as well. And I'm learning just like you have just learned. Because back in my mind, a couple hours ago, I was remembering an intel report. And again, we're kind of sort of playing this in the exercise, but we had sort of intel reports that we weren't going to get the next salvo of missiles, for the next 3 or 4 hours. And I had that information, but I didn't tell him. I wasn't passing along the information and being part of this sort of leadership and appreciation loop and enabling him to make great decisions. And I had not made a great decision either. I should have looked across the wing and said, hey, we have a lower threat of attack, so let's go to a different sort of posture because we can, and enabled even more people. Like his decision would have enabled, maybe a couple people on either side of him, but I could have enabled the entire wing to get after our mission even better with the same amount of risk if I had communicated well. And so what if I would have gotten the report from him that said, hey, a couple crew chiefs out there, in the Dragon's Lair are taking off their equipment because they feel like they need to get the A-10s fixed. I could have gone, well, yeah, why don't I tell that to everybody? Because we have a lower threat of North Korea attacking right now. Again, all inside the exercise scenario, but this is that loop, right? And so this culture of leader, it helps you as the senior leader. It helps your team as junior leaders, and it helps you to wire them in parallel, to give you a shared understanding, to give you a shared sense of mission execution, to really, just add an exponent to the execution and the capability that you have. And so is your team a team of leaders, and are they wired in parallel? So those are my 3 ridiculous intentionality. What I am telling you is what I think are the ultimate responsibilities of a leader: to rehearse reality, to resource the mission, to recultivate culture. This is your ultimate responsibility. This is how you will make the biggest impact. These are the needs that your organization has. And it needs to be a ridiculous commitment each and every day. This is about making your success equal to the success of those around you, and making this world better as it cascades out. And so that's my daunting task. I'm excited to have joined you guys today. And I have purposefully, kind of truncated the 27 years in just over 27 minutes to be able to take your questions, because I would love to hear your reflections and be able to add where I've left out. So Daryl and Raleigh, over to you.
Thank you, General, for your insights. Yeah, a lot of questions coming in, so we're doing our best to track some. So we'll send some your way. I think the one we'll start with is from Kevin, and his question is: given the current social environment, what has been your approach when you have entered as a leader or subordinate a unit culture that has some toxic components in it?
That's a great question. And I'll tell you, the reason I think it's such a great question is I think sort of these human flaws that we all have come to bear or come to light in maybe more intense ways just based on the added stress of the pandemic. And so I think it's even more important that we go back to sort of that rehearsing reality, right? What's the pre-mortem on that? As a leader, first of all, are you rehearsing sort of that level of stress? Do you also, are you also looking out inside of your culture to try to spot that? And are you trying to grow sort of that competence like you would in the leader-leader model to, really bring out the fact that we all have sort of this egocentric, self-preservation that through discipline and through practice, we can buy down and we can build sort of the empathy that we need to kind of connect with other folks. And so really it's a twofold exploration in terms of increasing sort of the temperature of the water where you can sort of see that. And then number two, individually working that through just how you develop people. And so as a leader, my approach, first of all, is really just to kind of lean in to sort of acknowledge that emotion and understand it. It might be that's, a root flaw that we need to get after, but not right now. And it might be sort of that it's just a circumstantial thing. We're all carrying a lot of stress. And so really, I just want to unpack that, and kind of withhold judgment, accept that, acknowledge that, and be empathetic. And empathetic isn't like, hey, why don't you cheer up? Do you want a sandwich, as Brene Brown would say, but really just trying to adapt the same sort of intensity of feelings by reminding yourself of something that equates to that. You might not be able to fully, take the same experience they have and get to that same emotional level, but you do need to find something within yourself to do that. So my, technique is to first just lean in and then listen, sort of with compassion as they go through and ask a lot of questions. And what else? And what else? And what else? And by unpacking that slowly, you'll get to the root of the issue. And I think that way you can really joint problem solve by that time. In other words, you can fully express sort of what they're going through to their agreement. And so you fully understand what they're going through, and then work through sort of the goods and bads and how we need to go forward from there. And so I think that's an important methodology. And I would also tell you that you can't ignore it. I have seen mistakes from leaders in times like this where they're just like, man, this is so intense. I don't have time for that, or excuse it, right? It's probably just based on COVID, right? It's not, sort of something we need to work on later on. You absolutely can't ignore it. And so you have to take it on. You have to find the time to take it on. And at a minimum, you have to acknowledge it. And so if for whatever reason, based on other priorities, you don't have the time to fully unpack it, you have to acknowledge it and say, hey, can I circle back with you? Again, and then also put up some boundaries of, that's not the right way to react. I know you're under a lot of stress or your impact would be this, but there's a better way to be a great teammate or be a great leader. So in summary, I would say to deal with it if you have time, but at least at a minimum, acknowledge it and kind of set boundaries to it. And then if you do have the time, lean in and listen, try to connect, but then also to joint problem solve to provide a way forward and then follow up to make sure that's accomplished.
Thank you, General. General, from Sarah, how do you get people to care about things that they don't care about?
Yeah, you don't. And so so really what it is I think explaining, connecting them to the mission. And I really believe in the saying, what's in it for them, right? I really think that sort of we are saying we are going to sign up for, even in the military, we say service above self, but that doesn't mean self goes away. You bring your personality, your character, your abilities. I want your hands and your heart as a leader. And so I want them to care about things. And so I need to find a way as a leader to sort of connect with what's important in their life and to enable that and to weave that through kind of what we do at work. And so there's opportunities there to maybe move them into a different position, give them, another sort of project, to put a different sort of spin on it, and not a spin in a sort of a negative, false way, but try to unpack, like I mentioned before, I got different reactions from my Fight Tonight speeches in the theater at Osan. Some people were truly excited. Some people were very fearful. But the more details I added to that when we elevated the classification level, sort of the excitement turned into, the reality of this is going to be hard, but we're prepared. And some of the worry turned into, okay, this is hard, but we are prepared. And so I think there's more details that you can add to that. Ultimately, if the person and sort of what they're passionate about does not match sort of the purpose and passion of your organization, it's not working together, I think it's very important to try to work with them and provide some sort of other avenue and to help them in that transition. I think it shows love and care. And I think the rest of your team who does care about what you care about will also see sort of that empathy in the fact that you care about them. And that will help sort of the bystanders that are so important in any kind of engagement like that.
Thanks, General. And I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm going to mispronounce your name, but Abhishek asks or says, thanks for your service, General. Could you talk a little bit about Space Command and the kind of leadership challenges this poses, being a unique frontier with no past that you can draw experiences from?
Ishak, thank you for that question. And there are a lot of unique challenges here at Space Command. We like to talk about challenges as opportunities. And being someone that likes to work out, I always think about the fact, what if I went into the weight room and all the weights were really light? Now, I might like that from sort of my lazy self, but in the end, we go to the gym to be sweaty and to build muscles. And so, we need friction in life to be able to pivot or even hold our ground. So there's various ways to sort of welcome challenges and opportunities. And that's one of the culture pieces that we're trying to put in place here at Space Command. And so as a leader, we are looking at the past, but we're looking at the past in other domains. And so you're right, there is not a lot, particularly when you talk about space as a warfighting domain. In other words, it's sort of a contested, congested, complicated space. It's not, sort of peaceful and benign and everybody's waving as they pass by in satellites. That's not how it's going on. The enemy recognizes that we enjoy an incredible economic and military advantage based on our space-based capabilities, and they want some of that, and they don't want us to have it. And so it's a different sort of mindset, and like you said, doesn't really have a big history, but we do have histories in sort of the other domains, the sea, the land, and the air domains. And so we're trying to leverage, the understanding. And like I said, I'm an airman inside Space Command, and one of the reasons and one of the things that I bring to this position is the fact that I'm very steeped in an air perspective. And so we're doing that through other lenses. We also are leveraging the commercial lens in very much ways as leading the charge into space. The launch on 30 May, wow, for the first time since the retirement of the shuttle in 2011, we're launching US astronauts from US soil. And here at Space Command, we provide the human spaceflight support to that. In other words, if there was some sort of emergency where they needed to immediately return to Earth, we would have forces there to recover them. And so as we sort of expand our thinking on space, we are partnering and leveraging the thinking in the commercial world as well. And then our allies are a huge part of that. They have a different perspective. They have other capabilities. And so we're trying to build that team and learn with each other. And so I would tell you, it is a daunting task as you highlight, but what we're trying to do is leverage other ways of looking at the problem and not only sort of then translate them into space, which is different, no gravity, and some other interesting features. But at the same time, there's lots out there. And then the other thing we're doing is problem storming in design. We're really trying to imagine what's not there by really opening up our minds and considering things not only outside the box, but beyond the box.
Hey, Tank, this is Charlie. Can I ask you sort of more of a personal question in the sense of, I know leadership is sort of a learning journey. I think it's probably one of the areas that we've bonded with. And I'm curious, kind of in that journey of it, what you're struggling with the most or what you're seeking kind of the most for.
Right now, you mean?
Yeah, like kind of like more in the present time and sort of, as we face different things in life, like I feel it questions like models we have, it questions kind of, is there a solution for this or that? I'm just curious, kind of in the challenge and struggle of this journey of learning and becoming a better leader, like what is that area for you right now in the present?
Yeah, Charlie, I would break that down, and that's a great question. really three parts for me, and they've been fairly consistent throughout my whole learning journey. That probably means I'm not a very good learner, or these are just really intense and hard things to learn. Either way, I would tell you that one of the biggest things in my life is just balance. And so, when you were talking about the brilliant and the basics and looking at that balance, I am passionate about leading my team, but the way I kind of talk to myself and I talk to other people and mentor other folks is, like, for example, I'm the chief of staff of Space Command. So I try to use the title of whatever job that I'm in, and I substitute my role at home. So I need to be the chief of staff, to my wife, and I need to be the chief of staff to my kids. And not that I necessarily take on those same sort of responsibilities, to my wife, I will always be her husband, and to my kids, I'll always be their dad. But do I pour the same level of energy and enthusiasm and, just thought and, all-consuming ridiculous intentionality, right? Do I pour that into my role as a father or as a husband just in the same way as I'm doing that as a chief of staff every day? And so I challenge myself in that area, and I often come up short. So balance is one of those first areas. The second one is prioritization. And, I'm a think out loud kind of guy. I'm an extrovert. And so, I love exploring other ideas. And I just, as a leader, particularly the higher up in rank you go, your sort of ideas and musings become other people's projects and tasks, and whether you want them to or not. And so I obviously to be careful with that, but then also organizationally, how do we make sure we communicate that? There's people that want something to be a higher priority than it really is. Or there's people that don't want that to be as high of a priority. And so you sort of have this institutional dynamic of how do you try to get the entire team composed of all these different personalities moving in the same direction, and do that on a very daily and regular basis. And so I continue to struggle with not only individually, but organizationally, particularly in the job that I'm in, with how do you do that? Because in my opinion, if you can do that well, you basically are going to bypass good and not be trapped by good and get to great. Obviously borrowing from Jim Collins's book, but I just point that out because so often we sort of settle for the good in every day and just running around doing what I call the important and unurgent, or the urgent and unimportant, and not getting after the long range important things. And so prioritization is the second thing. And then feedback. I hunger for feedback. I grew up in the fighter pilot community. After every ride, we would sit down and we would break apart, all the mechanics. And so I grew up, it's also my personality, is I want to understand the impact that I've had. I want to understand what I've done good and what I've done bad. I'm hungry for that. And I think all of us really appreciate that when we get to it. And it hurts, right? And how do you handle that, right? Do you have a battle buddy, or a talking partner, as they would say at Next Jump, to help you process through that and turn sort of that feedback into good things, and to avoid sort of the negative side of negative self-talk, right? It can't turn into shaming. It needs to turn into guilt, right? I haven't done it well and I need to do it better. And so how do I do it better? And right, taking that journey is really important. But at the same time, can we create a culture that's honest with each other, both up and down the chain? And so that we're having sort of that honest dialogue. And, not that you're right and I'm wrong, but what do we think? And how do we make that helpful? And how do we sort of suspend judgment and just consider the nuggets and the intentionality of making each other better behind that? I know you guys are working with the feedback app, and I really appreciate sort of the instantaneous and the encouragement that brings. But really, how do you make that sort of institutional and cultural based? And then, for me, because I'm a part of that culture, do I take the time to provide feedback? Do I sort of provide the rah-rah? Do I overlook issues and hard conversations when maybe I shouldn't? Do I actually carve out time on my calendar to really sit down and to nut through sort of some hard feedback? And then do I ask, and that's really putting yourself out, hey, I'd really like some feedback on this, and be willing to ask again to get it, or again and again to get it. And so, Charlie, I would say, those three areas are continued struggles in my growth as a leadership. And I wholeheartedly agree that it is a process of getting better and better. And you kind of get better and then get worse and then get better and then get worse. I love that model sort of if you're not regressing, you're really not going to the gym, right? You're getting sore. And then finally you make that breakthrough where now you can put up, a larger bench press or a faster spin time or whatever. But it's through regression, right? And that hard work that we make progression. So thank you for that question.
General, question from Adam. He asks, how do you deal with conflicts between what superiors above you are asking from your team and what your team needs or wants from you?
Yeah, that's something we come up with, in every walk of life, and the military is no exception from that. And so it is your job, first of all, to deal with it. So I would encourage people that might sound obvious, but I've seen too often times that you either as a leader, end up trying to shield your team, sort of from that. So either you take it on yourself or you don't actually pass it on and you just kind of hope it goes away, or vice versa. You don't really reflect back up to the leader, particularly when the task is being handed out, and, sort of convey the constraints and restraints of your team, which you probably already know as the leader, or at least should know. And so first of all, I would say is deal with it. Like, you have to take that on. And I think it's important to be clear. And then it's important to decide if, what we say in the military, fall on your sword. And like I mentioned in my earlier story of when my commander told me to go back in and tell everybody flying was back on. I could have resigned my command at that time and taken myself out of the equation. But again, I don't recommend that, except for sort of, hey, this is an illegal order, or this is an illegal something to do. But barring that, I think it's your job as a leader to stay involved. And if you don't understand, try to ask for more clarification, but you do need to take that on. And then I think, like I said, you need to present kind of the pros and cons, and then you need to iterate. Because I don't think it's sort of this, all right, well, your supervisor's telling you this, your team's going to think that, you present that, you get told, no, we still are going to do that. You go, okay. And then you go back down and then you tell your team and they go, yeah, well, what about this? And you said, well, never mind. And you just kind of sort of repeat the conversation that you just had with your boss, and maybe you get some more information from them. And then you just go, yep, but we're moving out. I had that conversation. So therefore, my job as the leader is done. I don't think that's the case. I think it's to take what they've had, digest it. Leadership is not a window, as I like to say. So you can't just turn back around and go make their argument back up to your supervisor. You have to really go, okay, I've been involved in both of these conversations and maybe a couple iterations on both ends. So how do I synergize that? And in the end, just like I've talked about with, an employees whose values don't match your values, you have to resolve that. And so one, I really try to make sure that I fully understand both sides of the coin. And a lot of times I find, that sort of the difference is created by a misunderstanding of the full level of details. And so I want to understand fully from my team. I want to understand fully from my supervisor, because the supervisor could be considering things that I don't even know are going on inside the company, and I'm just a small part of that. And so through that understanding, I'd tell you that in my experience, about 90% of the disputes are actually resolved. And then if you look at it from sort of a joint problem solving mentality, to where you say, yes, but, like, in other words, yes, our team can do this, but we are not going to be able to do these things, or no, which means no, we can't do this. And instead, we would like to take these on. And so I think if you think of sort of those situations, and then if you could eventually resolve them to a yes, and so yes, and we will slow down this other project, and sort of you're offering a solution. So that's kind of the journey that I tried to take. There are some times when it just comes down to they're your supervisor for a reason, and you need to take that on, but that can't be your first default option.
Thank you, General. And we're nearing the end of our time. We're over our time. I'd like to do one last question. I apologize to participants that we weren't able to get to more questions. But the last question, General, is who has been the most influential individual in your life to model your ideal example of leadership, and why?
Well, I would have to first acknowledge my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And I would just tell you that I feel like in terms of servant leadership, which is the core, is really important. And that's a very personal thing for me. And I'm not endorsing that at all. In the military, we believe that sort of the spiritual journey from all folks, you know, in all walks of life is really important, and they're free to pursue that. But that is my individual number one model of that behavior, you know, willing to sort of lay down your life. And then I would also, you know, right after that, and for sort of a more human example, I would say it's the Spartans. And on the coin that I've carried around with me for several commands, I've always had the Aspa shield. And this shield represents, you know, it's iconically Spartan. If you've seen like the movie 300 or whatever, a small force of folks, you know, fully dedicated to each other, incredible amount of combat capability. And they carried the shield, and as they got sent off to war, they would say, come back home with your shield or come back on it. In other words, don't lose your shield. And your shield, actually, as you wore it on your left hand, protected the person to your left. And so down the line, to where the person to your right was actually protecting you as you fought the enemy. And this phalanx, you know, is just so critical. And so that idea of the fact that we grow and help, and our success is measured by how we take care of the person to our left, and sort of how that is symbolized and iconic, you know, inside the Spartan culture, has just been a model sort of that I keep in my head, that's really important. And it makes it practical, because we don't always, thankfully, get the chance to lay down our life for the person next to us. We're willing to do that. But how do I make that sort of a daily habit? And that's literally just taking care of the person in front of me, and like I said, caring for them, and making the now and that person the most important thing that's going on. And I appreciate that question. That's a tough one to answer, but that's kind of at the core of what I believe as a leader, and what I try to model, not successfully every day, but like Charlie said, it's a journey.
If I could, Darryl, maybe if I could just
Please.
say something at the end, Tank. I just wanted to thank you, because that was Megan speaking, for the rest of the group, because we met years ago, and I was just thinking how, you know, we talk about the best leaders are balanced in confidence and humility, kind of the mother of all character traits. They're confidently humble. And like when I hear you speak, it's reminding me just how you exude that, because a lot of leaders, I think, especially getting to the level that you're at, they have a hard time even answering questions like Charlie asked, right, around what are your struggles. And you didn't go like 2 inches deep. You went pretty deep. And I feel like that's just rare. It's rare to see. But also the confidence to know what you know. The piece I loved, I'll just share that I love that I'm taking, I loved a lot of it. But if you're not regressing, you're not going to the gym, and through the hard work, we make progression. I thought that was awesome, because I feel, especially as senior leaders too, you feel like you shouldn't be regressing, and there's shame and guilt and all that stuff that comes with that. But that is exactly how you grow. We talk about that using different language and different terms, but I love it because it's exactly what we need to grow. So I just want to thank you. It was awesome. And it can probably help on the balance, the prioritization, feedback could probably help in different ways, but
Right.
a lot to help.
Well, you guys have helped my journey in immense ways. And I'll tell you, Megan, a lot of my understanding of care and humility comes from your example. So thank you.
Thanks, Tank. That means a lot. Thank you. It's so nice. This was awesome. I want you to come back every week, but I know you don't have time. You're in the Space Command.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I just want to, if I have a little bit of time, just say thanks to everybody and their continued dedication. You know, it takes a lot of energy, believe it or not, like I think we've all seen, to kind of show up in these Zoominars, if you will, and to try to move it ahead despite things being just crazy different. And I just want to thank everybody that joined. And then again, just for the great opportunity. I always get more out than I give. And it's also fun to be among like-minded folks and friends. So thank you all.
Thank you again, General, for your insights and your time with us. And we hope you'll be, all of you, all our participants, we hope you'll be able to join us this afternoon, 5 p.m. for our gratitude session as well. So thank you all for joining us for this session. As I mentioned before we kicked off, we'd love to get your feedback for the General, for myself, for Raul. So if you'll please stay with us, I will quickly share my screen and take you through a quick feedback demo, but we'd love to get your feedback so we can make these better each week. So I'll do that now. If you'll stay with me, please.